So what I will be presenting today is a presentation will have mainly two parts. The first one focused on the topic of my PhD thesis, which is the movement for Catalan lyric theatre. And I will present the problems that I found in the state of the art, of how it was studied, my approach. And the second part will focus mostly on the comparison with the Lithuanian case of the Lithuanian musical theatre during the National Awakening. So I will later on introduce the causes of why this comparison, but let's start with one of the main issues that I wanted to introduce. That was let's start with the use of musical theatre to introduce the idea of the national operas and how we should go beyond them. I speak of, and I will use the term musical theatre to speak broadly of different performing arts genres that use music, from opera to operetta and everything in between, including musical drama, etc. I think that's an approach that we should have into consideration when we study these phenomena, because the traditional historiography musically has focused on the national operas, on studying only the genre of the opera, mostly because it's considered the most elevated form of art and the most civilized. So usually to evaluate the success of the process of national construction, we take opera as the paradigm that we should achieve to consider if this was successful or not. But there are many other genres in between. And I think it's especially interesting to have this in mind when we study the national awakenings that take place in this period, the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Because in this moment, there are a lot of changes in society and the modernization of culture is taking place. We see that the process of canonization of the opera, it's already very evolved. So we have a canon of titles that are being performed and very few titles are being introduced. While we have a lot of new creation on other genres of musical theatre. So sometimes when we look at only at the opera, we see that not many new pieces are being composed, and we might think that maybe the new national culture was not being created through musical theatre because there are no operas, but instead we have many other genres. So we should keep this kind of broad approach when we go to the topic. And also because the nationalism is a plural phenomenon. This is the concept used in the national studies field, is that nationalism is a theory that needs to approach and be articulated throughout a thicker ideology. So what this means is that nationalisms were not unified movements that had only one direction and one approach and one style, but they had a lot of inner issues and inner plurality and different ideologies within the same group. So usually these different approaches to how they think of the nation create and consume different forms of art. So we will see a plurality of different styles also based on this ideological difference within nationalism. So my approach here is that instead of thinking of a unified national discourse that usually focuses on opera, we should pretend to identify the different trends that are being staged and how each one responds to a different ideological view of the nation. Okay. So I will start introducing the case of study of my thesis and how I started approaching the topic. So to locate ourselves, we are on the last years of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century in Catalonia, where the process of the national awakening is kind of evolved and now is approaching a stage in which they want to pass and pay attention not only to the language and the literature and reviving the language, but on creating national styles in the rest of the arts, in the plastic arts, architecture, and also musical theatre. And musical theatre here plays a very interesting role. It's not only one more form of art, but it's the form of art that is considered to be total. It includes literature, music, dance, painting on the scenographies, architecture if there are buildings in the theater, and it's also a very important tool to address the people. The cultural product that the masses are consuming at this moment is musical theater. So if you have ideas that you want to spread through people, you will put them in musical theater. So we see here, for example, the principal theater in Barcelona, the main theater of the city, that during at least 6 to 7 years was ruled by a company of musical theater. So we see that it was not only one genre between many other, but they were occupying the main spaces of the city. Also, the cultural movement that was taking place at this moment was Catalan modernism. That's the word that they used to exemplify that they were modernizing their culture, which internationally is known as Art Nouveau. And as I mentioned, they were using the special musical theater to address the masses. Okay, so how did they structure their thinking? What they call for is a rejection of the traditional foreign influences. When we look at how the cultural panorama was in Catalonia at the moment, we see a lot of Castilian zarzuela, a lot of Italian opera, and also translations of French comedies and vaudeville. So they wanted to not only create repertoire in Catalan, but to find their own genre or their own style that was intrinsically Catalan, rejecting these foreign influences. And one of the, or we could say that the most important element in the cultural theory here in this moment that was considered to represent the essence of the nation was the folk song, because it is very symbolic, because it has lyrics, so it's sung in the national language, and it's a cultural element that is transmitted orally through generations. So it's kind of establishing a connection throughout time, throughout the people of the same nation that lived in the same territory, because they were passing the songs from generation to generation in the same towns. So we see a very, previous to the addressing the musical theater, we see that there's a very strong willing to compilate in the rural areas these traditional songs. They are later on harmonized to be sung in the choirs that are being established on the bigger cities and industrialized spaces. And this last stage, which is the one that I'm studying, is when these songs are being staged in the theater, either included as part of other operettas or musical dramas, or when the whole plot of the piece is based on the lyrics of this folk song. Okay, so this is what was taking place at the moment, and I will address now how was this considered in historiography, or how it has been studied until now. So yes, I will start pointing out also that although internationally, usually, as I mentioned, we study these phenomena focusing on the national opera, here we never really studied, or was never a discourse of national opera, because it was not staged there. So this kind of discourse or history never appeared. Not because the composers were not interested. There are some of them that wrote different Catalan operas, but the Catalan Opera House, the Liceu in Barcelona, opposed radically the performance and representation of these operas in Catalan, because they thought that the language of culture was Italian and opera had to be in Italian. So even if some of these Catalan operas were staged eventually there, they were translated from Catalan to Italian to be staged there. So, and I would say that it's not an issue of politics or repression. I would say that here the issue taking place is an issue of class and the consideration of language, because the theater was private and they themselves were considering that Catalan was a language of peasants, so they did not want to feel like peasants, so they were not using Catalan in the theater. So we have a class issue here within the same people that were Catalan, that were not appreciating their own language here. But the thing is that Catalan opera never was really a thing, and the discourse on national Catalan opera was never created. So when they approached this repertoire, what they found and what they had to deal with was musical theater. Although what they were looking for was, or they wanted to find, was opera. So the approach here was difficult to treat. The thing here is that this repertoire of musical theater was considered as, by historians, as eclectic, undefined, heterogeneous, and as a conglomerate of different pieces without apparent similarities, without a clear line of action or style, or without an articulated ideological discourse. So what's happening here is that they were, as I mentioned, wanting to find this national opera, and instead they found different kind of musical dramas, operettas, symbolistic pieces that did not, or was too difficult to classify them and evaluate them together as a unified repertoire. So eventually it was being considered just as a conglomerate of different stuff being done by people that didn't have clear what they wanted to achieve, or that didn't have the meanings or the training to create these operas that should have been done. And also it was considered a failed project basically because of the economical criteria, because many of these companies were economically precarious, and many of their directors eventually went into bankruptcy, and this led to also a discontinuity in the different projects that were being taking place in Catalonia. So there's a lack of institutionalization. There is no main space that is the theater for Catalan musical theater, or a company that lasts for many years. So they considered that it was a failed project, basically because of the economical and institutional criteria. And one of the elements that I have to point out, which I will be treating later on, because it's been my main source of study, is the press, what they say in the press, and because it's a way of spreading essays of ideology and the theories that they are thinking of, and to share them between themselves within the Catalan intellectual people. But also there's a lot of reviews of the pieces, so we can eventually trade their thinking and the kind of theater and ideas that they were defending by the kind of reviews that they were giving of the pieces. But let's first address the journal Joventut, because this idea that we should, or the thing that had to be found was opera, came from here. Joventut was one of the main journals led by the Catalan intelligentsia, and it was taken by researchers as the main source of the theories in theater. So what they were saying in this journal was taken as the model that should be found on the practice. And what we find here is that in Joventut they are calling for is a very post-romantic approach to Catalanism. So they are still calling for this big Wagnerian opera that should be imported here, and that what we should do was create this big Wagnerian opera. So when you have this ideological approach and what you find is not what they are saying that should be done, there's a kind of a mismatch here between the documents that you preserve and the ideas that they are saying on the press that should be performed. So that's why it led also to thinking that the movement was a failure. Okay. So which was my approach to kind of solve this problem, or rethink it, or make sense of what the reality was, the reality of musical theater was, compared to this search for the national opera. The first thing was creating a catalog of the pieces that had been performed. So I took the main companies that were performing and dedicated to musical theater in Barcelona, but not also in the city, but looking also to the whole region. I cataloged the pieces that they performed and the titles, because many times we don't have the documents. So if you only study the pieces that you preserve, you have a biased approach here, because also many times many of the pieces that are preserved are the ones that were not staged, because they were left in a drawer, so they were not lost, because they didn't go to the theater. And some of the most popular ones are not preserved, because when they were, or the companies or some other companies in other cities asked for the scores, they were being transported, so they were being moved and passed by different people. There was no musical printing here, so I would say that 99% of the scores that we have are handwritten, so it was very easy to lose the copies. So it was very important for me to catalog throughout the press also which were the pieces that were being performed and which were the ones that were being performed the most and the most popular. And I used especially the text search engines on the databases of digitalized historical press to look for information about just the terms Catalan lyric theater, as they call themselves, the movement, or to look for the titles of the pieces. And we see that these kind of journals, these few journals as Joventut, led by the Catalan intellectuality, spoke of musical theater, but there were many more other diaries and journals that also spoke of musical theater and that were Catalan, part of the Catalan movement. So the first step was broadening the examples of ideas and journals and sources that we were dealing with. Eventually, there were more than 20 diaries throughout the whole Catalonia that were speaking actively of musical theater and giving reviews and their ideas on how it should be created and how the nation should be represented throughout musical theater. And I have to point out also the not only journals dedicated to culture or specifically about performing arts or theater included information on this topic, but also many religious and traditionalist journals were very active regarding the review and just giving out opinions on how the national culture should be. So religion here is also, and traditionalism, which is very linked also to Catholicism here at this moment, are also playing an important role in the building of a national culture that I wouldn't have expected at the beginning, and that was not also thought of by other researchers that approached the topic. We usually stay on the national political side and the use of folklore to represent the nation, but actually here we see that religion, actively the church is trying to look for a place within the national movement to link themselves to the nation, to kind of, in a moment of political struggle and new ideas going on, the church intentionally had the intention of linking themselves to the national ideas, because if the nation feels Catholic, you are ensuring your place in society and your place of power in the national state. Yes, so the religious matter was also very relevant and something to consider here. And once I had identified these journals, what I did was using very literary approach to discourse analysis. So I was taking the reviews and looking for the words or ideas that were useful to identify the trend that the editorial line was defending. So sometimes they were not explicitly saying that the kind of theater that we want is this with its characteristics, but if you evaluate and analyze the reviews and what they consider positive or not, you end up having also an idea of what the editorial line of the journal is defending. And also this had to be done because there was a very open battle, dialectical battle between journals regarding the pieces that were performed. So sometimes you address one piece that was very popular in the principal theater of Barcelona, for example, And about the same piece, you have reviews about it being extremely great and the perfect way of representing the nation. And about the same piece, another journal will say the complete opposite. Sometimes they said that it was a very Wagnerian and total work of art, because they were putting together very well the different languages of the art, music and the word and how it relates to each other. And maybe another journal was saying exactly the opposite, that they are not putting together well one thing and the other. So you end up realizing that the differences and the approach that they are using to evaluate the pieces is usually not artistic but ideological, depending on what the piece is representing and if they agree or not with the ideas. So basically, these are the different categories that I could identify in the press, or the different genres that were being defended by different sides of the press on what genre should be the Catalan genre of musical theatre. So what we find is, for example, so we have a section of usually the illustrated journals, the journals that mainly include printed pictures that were very visual. Those defended an artistically refined theatre for the aesthetic education of popular classes. So usually they supported symbolistic theatre because it was usually directed by painters, so there was a lot of focus on the visual part. They were very suggestive. They used a lot of different lights, colors to suggest ideas together with the music. And to evaluate them, to evaluate the pieces, they usually use the terms in the reviews. They evaluate if it was artistic, suggestive, and popular. And then we have the religious journals that are looking for a moral form of theatre according to the Catholic values, and they focus especially on a repertoire that is family friendly. So the children can also go there, because they are also very worried about how to create a national culture that also the children can consume, so they will grow up also being familiar with the folk song and tales and morals that are being performed and transmitted by these pieces. We have journals, especially the satirical journals, that defend a musical comedy. They defend the importation and translation of vaudeville from France, and comedies that include influences of American jazz, for example. The cakewalk is very used here. And the terms that they use to evaluate the pieces are if they are comic, if they include jokes, if the people laugh, if they applaud, or if they smile. So these are their criteria to evaluate the pieces. We have journals that defend a dramatic theatre based on narrative action, so very literary pieces. And the terms that they use to evaluate them are, they especially talk about the action of the pieces, its development, and they mention how many acts and scenes the pieces have, and explain very well the action taking place in each scene. So this is also very useful to know what the pieces were about when we don't preserve the texts. And then we have journals such as the Juventud, the one that I mentioned before, that defended this very operatic format. So we see that the ideas that were used to evaluate the whole repertoire of musical theatre were taken from this one group, from the group of journals that defended the big operatic format. But we can see that there were many other diaries speaking about theatre, and that many other ideas and styles were also being defended as representative of the nation. Okay. Oops. Okay. And another idea that I think it's important to keep in mind when addressing and evaluating this repertoire is the idea of the symbolic capital, and we are linking this to the previous idea of the economical failure. To how do we evaluate a company of musical theatre that is trying to construct this new national repertoire? The economical criteria was used, but I think that we should have an approach closer to the symbolic capital, to the concept of the symbolic capital. because the actors and directors themselves and the business people here, they themselves they were very personally active within the ideological battle of nationalism. So they themselves had a very activist position, and they did not enter the business looking for economical profit, but for the creation of a valuable national culture and the spread of the language, and providing their people of a means of entertainment that they can consume in their language and that they feel represented with. So their approach from the very beginning was to create this repertoire that represented the nation. And many of them actually, we see actually many painters and composers that they themselves go into business. They use their own money that they had inherited or that they had saved from previous years and previous companies, and they invest that to put together one season of musical theater. So this is why we have a lack of also of institutionalization, because we have separate seasons here and there in different theaters led by different people. So there is no institutional connection between them, but they were very personally active in this matter. So they put usually one season of musical theater, they ran out of money, and then they went to other projects, they saved more money again, and they put another season together. So this was the approach. And so their idea from the very beginning was not to make money out of it. They knew that they were in many occasions that they were not going to make profit, because the expenses that they were creating to stage the pieces were higher than the maximum that they could make out of the tickets. So from the very beginning, they knew that it was a very deficitary system. We have the example, very paradigmatical, of La Santa Espina by Enric Morera and Àngel Guimerà, one of the I would say the most relevant piece of the repertoire, maybe, that includes Sardana, considered to be the national dance, that up to this day is being very often performed and has survived until this day as part of the cultural imaginary. So it had a very strong impact at the moment and strong repercussion afterwards. And we can see here some of the scenes that were put together for this performance. So we see that they created very big castles with the stairs and the walls, the very luxurious interior of these palaces. There were very fantastic caves and fantastic spaces, gardens with many plants, and also natural landscapes. So I think that up to 9 different stages were created only for this piece. There were around 50 people on a stage that they had to be paying to be on a stage, and it was very long also to be represented. So instead of having 3 different seasons in the same day of short pieces and getting the money from 3 tickets, they were getting the money for 1 ticket to go and see this very long piece that also was very expensive to produce every day, because you had to pay the salary of many people. So even though it was the most successful piece, and the dance included here was sung by people and people loved it, and it was on a stage for months because people were asking to see it, the more that they represented this piece, the less money they had, because they were selling out the whole theater, but it was more expensive to pay the people performing than the money that they were making. But still, they kept the piece running for months and months, and on the next season it came back again. So we see that their goal was not to make money, it was to provide people with a highly cultural form of art. So when evaluating their success, we have to keep in consideration that this was their goal, and they partially achieved it, and the economical criteria was very secondary. Okay. And also I wanted to mention, to wrap up this first part, the use, or how we evaluate the use of the folk citations in musical theater, the use of folk songs or myths that are included within the pieces. Because, well, it happened here, especially the musical visions that I will explain later on. This genre of symbolistic musical theater was strictly based on the folk songs. So usually they took the song, they harmonized it, they orchestrated, they made it longer, and the whole piece was the staging of this song. And also in operetta they were including these pieces, but it was criticized many times and still today evaluated as that sometimes the use of these folk songs in the theater was very simple. It was not very elevated. They didn't introduce enough variations to make it sound lyrical enough for the theater, or they kept very simple rhythms or very simple. The melodies were very plain to be compared to the Italian melodies that were way more melodic. So many times it's evaluated compared to other more elaborate forms of musical theater and an opera, and when analyzing it, we go to the conclusion that they are very simple, or that they are not elaborated enough. But I think it's important also to read and be aware of what they were thinking themselves, what the value of this folk song was for themselves, and how they thought of it. Because at the moment, in these first decades of the 20th century, for these nationalist movements, the folk song was not only a musical material to start with and to be inspired to create more music, it had a very strong symbolical value. So as I mentioned before, the folk song was considered to be one of the representatives of the essence of the nation. It had been passed from centuries from generation to generation, like this, keeping these lyrics and this melody and this rhythmical pattern. So if we change how the song is, we are changing the essence of the nation. So we are not allowed to modify it, because we cannot change the essence of our nation, or it wouldn't be the same national culture. So in their thinking, this very symbolic value was making the folk songs quite untouchable. So many times they did not introduce any kind of variations or modifications, because they intentionally wanted to keep the piece like this and the song like it was originally retrieved from these rural sources in the towns. Because many times also the same composers were the ones that were going to these rural towns to collect the songs from the people. So they wanted to preserve the essence of this. And we can start also introducing the Lithuanian topic, because I found also similar comments here. I think it was reading about Egle by Petrauskas, also analyzing the introduction of the folk songs here. I read some comments that the rhythm of these parts of the piece where folk songs were being introduced was very stable, and he didn't introduce any kind of interest or variation or dynamicy in the use of the rhythm. So it was introduced as a critique of keeping this musical number very simple. But when we go, for example, and read the theories and ideas that Chirlonis explains about the folk song, he's saying in the same period that one of the main characteristics of the Lithuanian folk song is that it keeps a very stable rhythm. And through repeating the same rhythmical pattern, you end up kind of we could say, paraphrasing, in a kind of a hypnotical state, because it kind of leads you into this loop. So if we follow the same reasoning that the Catalan people are explaining themselves, if you introduce changes to this rhythmical pattern, you would be changing and altering one of the main characteristics of the folk song. So I think it's important also to have this kind of theoretical ideas in mind when we evaluate and when we analyze these pieces, because it might be in some cases, and it is true, we also find in the Catalan case that some composers were not skilled enough and they couldn't make very complex pieces because they didn't have the technical abilities to create something very complex. But we also have to keep in mind that sometimes these changes and variations were not wanted to be introduced intentionally, because you wanted to keep the folk piece as it was to preserve its essence. So to wrap up this part, after this review that I did of the press and kind of classifying these different trends and these different approaches that were within the movement, we can rethink the initial approach to the repertoire that was given before by other historians, that it was just a conglomerate of different ideas and different pieces that were different from each other, and that they were musical theater because they couldn't make a big format opera. And we could rethink this idea and see that actually maybe they were aware of what they were doing, and there were clear styles and clear patterns that they wanted to follow. But the problem is that not everyone wanted to do the same, and that's why the repertoire looks very different, and we have pieces that are very different from each other, because there were a plurality of different discourses and ideas going on about how the national genre and the national repertoire should be. So this is why I'm introducing here the concept of, or I was introducing the concept of national pluralism, because within the same national group we have different theories, different necessities in society going on that are responded with different cultural approaches and different genres. So another conclusion that I was taking from here is that actually, well, if we go back to the different approaches that the Catalan nationalism was having to create a new national culture and a new national musical theater, the genres that they are using are quite international. They are not looking, or they are not creating a very specific new style, but they are nationalizing or creating their own national tradition out of musical comedy that was coming from France, or symbolistic theater that was also coming from the northern part of the Francophone countries. Or they were looking to this Wagnerian opera. So they are using very international ideas and trying to make their own national style or tradition out of them. So my hypothesis that led to this project of comparison with the Catalan case with another international case was that precisely that the process seen here of national construction is not unique and different. And if we look to other international cases, and we look for other similar nationalisms taking place during the same period in Europe, we will eventually find very similar patterns, and they will find that they are using similar techniques to construct their national culture. So what I wanted to perform was this comparative case of study, looking for another nationalism from the same period with similar characteristics, to see if what they were doing, if their way to create and to address the construction of a national theory, a national culture, was similar or not. Also because within the Spanish historiography, this idea that the Catalan people and Catalan intellectuals wanted to disconnect from the Castilian influence and from the Italian influence, it was seen as a process of isolation. They are using their own folklore to create their own thing, so they want to disconnect from everyone else and be very local, and not know what's going on in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. Also reinforcing that the historical discourse that Spain and the peninsula, the Iberic Peninsula, was always different from Europe and had its own kind of rhythms and things going on. But I believe that we were actually quite connected to what was going on in the rest of Europe. So throughout this comparison with another case, I pretended to normalize the Catalan nationalism and integrate it within the European context of other national awakenings, and also to see if it was possible to find common patterns to understand the national creation of culture as a common phenomenon, as a transnational phenomenon in Europe. So what I wanted to find was another national awakening that was similar to the Catalan one, mainly being sub-statal, so a region that is nationally awakening within a bigger state during the same period of time. So we would be speaking of the fin de secular period or early modernism for the first decades of the 20th century, and I would be focusing on the creation of new genres of musical theater that represent the nation. And intentionally, I was looking for another case that was far away geographically from Catalonia, because I was not looking to study the influences that they received. So, for example, if we look at France or Portugal, Portugal is at the same time also having some kind of national awakening, but they are probably receiving similar influences because they are geographically close. So they are having Spain close, they are probably looking also at Italian opera, and I was not looking to see or to study the geographical influences, but to study another case of national awakening that was completely independent from the Catalan one, to see how they were addressing the same problem, but within a very different geopolitical context. And also, I didn't have that in mind at the very beginning, but it was also very interesting to see. Since I explained before, religion had a very strong relevance within the construction of a national culture here. And when I decided to take the example of Lithuania, eventually we see that also Lithuania is a Catholic, has a Catholic society. So also religion and Catholicism and its ideas are also playing a role in the construction and the building of the national culture. So this was also another element that was common between them, and that was very interesting to see how it played a role in this construction. So eventually the case that I found for this comparison was the case of Lithuania. So what I will do now for this second part is to present the characteristics of both nationalisms and see how they present the same trends. And I will present the repertoire that they develop and how we can classify it in the same kind of styles or genres. So we can see that actually there's a common pattern to understand both of them. So, as I mentioned, we are speaking of sub-statal national awakenings. So we are looking at regions that form part at this moment of a larger state. And also very interesting the case of language, because they both present a language dysglosia and class connotations in the use of language. So in the case of Catalonia, we see that Spanish, and also, as I mentioned in the opera, Italian was the language of culture, and Catalan was a secondary language, a language of peasants. And in Lithuania, we have a similar thing going on with Lithuania. Lithuanian is considered the peasant language, and we find a lot of theater in Polish and opera in Russian, but there are no cultural offers to consume in Lithuanian language. Also, we see that the new intellectual class that is appearing here, leading the national movement, has a popular background instead of coming from the traditional nobility. So in Catalonia, we have Enric Morera and Adrià Gual, for example, as one of the main cases. Morera came from a family of musicians, and Adrià Gual's father owned a lithography. So they came from these popular working backgrounds. And in the cases of Lithuania, some of the main figures that we can mention would be Petrauskas and Čiurlionis, which were sons of musicians in the church that arrived to musical education, receiving grants to study abroad. So we see that they are not coming from these high classes, but from popular backgrounds. So this means that they are also, when we introduce the idea of the folk song and the folk culture as being representative of the nation, since they were coming from these backgrounds, they were acquainted and they were familiar with this folk background, while probably higher classes and higher nobility were consuming some other kind of culture and were not as familiar with the folk. Characteristics that are common to both are also that they are movements based on the civil mobilization and activism. So we see here that it is not being led by the institutions. We don't have big institutions that are pushing forward the creation of new national repertoires, but it's the people that are very interested, that are making a very strong personal effort to put together these companies and these performances. So in Catalonia, we would be speaking, for example, of Lluís Graner, which rented the Principal Theatre in Barcelona, as I mentioned, to have these stable seasons. That he was a painter and he used all of the money that he had inherited from his family to put together, for example, La Santa Spina, and ended up in a very strong bankruptcy. And in the Lithuanian case, the figure of Petrauskas will be also worth mentioning, and the task that he did, for example, in the Lithuanian communities in the States, going personally to open new conservatoires and establish choir societies to teach the people and to actively be there with the people to push forward their musical education and starting this chain reaction of culturizing the people. And so at the very beginning, I was speaking of a lack of institutionalization in the Catalan case. Here in Lithuania, we can see the words of Sofia Cirolinone saying that it is not institutions who make culture, but cultural people who make cultural institutions for themselves. So there was also a strong will of creating new companies. Also, a lot of amateur things were going on because they were creating new things from the people of the nation. Also, the creation of the National Theatre and the National Opera will be taking place here, so they are not reusing previous institutions, but making their own ones. And well, as I was also already mentioning with the case of Petrauskas, there is also a strong pedagogical intention to instruct the people. So in Catalonia, we see a lot of theories, and they are very worried about creating repertoires that the working classes and in the cities can consume, because they don't want them to consume Spanish zarzuela or go to the music hall. They want to create a product that is cultural, that is elevated enough, that is moral, that includes these folk references, that it's in the national language, because it's not only a way of entertaining the people, but of translating them these ideas, the language, and these moral concepts also. And they were very worried with also providing culture for the children. So especially in the musical visions, they would write a lot of pieces, including children, partially or even totally. There were some of them that were completely staged by children, because in this way you are not only providing a repertoire that the children can consume, that can go and see and hear the language and hear the songs, but you are making the children themselves learn the language and learn. They usually, when numbers of sardana, the national dance, were included, they were always performed, or most of the times performed by children, because you would be making those children learn how to dance the sardana. So it was a way also of incorporating the children, making them active within the movement, and teaching them from a very young age to participate in this cultural process of creation. And same here when Petrauskas was here in Lithuania, going around different schools, auditioning the children to put on stage his operettas. The process that we see is also very similar. And as I've already mentioned, the folk song for both of them is the main element that represents the nation, the introduction of folk songs and myths in the theatre. So we, as we saw in the Catalan case, we also see here a process of compilation of folk songs, harmonizing them to be sung by the choirs, and also end up introducing them in the staging of the pieces. So we see here, for example, the text of one of the Lithuanian operettas, that it's including 3 or 4 folk songs also in its staging. And so now that we've seen that we have 2 models of national awakenings that share the main characteristics and that present the very similar ideas within the national process of national construction, let's see what are the main trends in which we can group the repertoire. Where were the different repertoires that were being staged here? And I made 3 categories. So in both cases, we see a repertoire of popular operetta, which I believe that in most cases, in a quantitative level, it was the most representative one. These operettas are depicting traditional scenes of popular life. They are fun and entertaining, and they introduce easy songs Usually their content is considered to be intellectually low, and the originality is not too important, and often we can see translations from either the translation of text from other languages with new music, or the translations with rearrangements of other musical pieces that are introduced. And this repertoire was, in the Catalan case, very intentionally coming from the authors. It was aimed for the working classes and for the working people, so they would have something to consume in Catalan. And they tried to start the process of substitution of the Spanish zarzuela with the Catalan operetta. And in the Lithuanian case, we can see also that operetta was especially popular in the communities abroad, especially in the United States, that were people, these communities were made of working people. So operetta was their way of having fun, but also of gathering and speaking in their language, hearing their songs, and seeing these popular scenes and popular characters on stage. So we can see here some pictures of the Catalan cases, the Catalan operetta company, and some of the popular scenes that were being performed, and some of the popular characters with the traditional costumes put on. And in the Lithuanian case, we can also see some pictures of the one in the left and in the right are different stagings of Kaminkratis ir Malunininkas, and in the middle we have Chigonai. So we can see also how the popular characters were being staged and presented to people that were living in working communities. And another category that we can think of would be the mythological theater with music, that we could subdivide in the medievalist trends and the fantastic trends. And this is probably the most unstudied one in both cases. And I believe that one of the most interesting, ideologically and artistically, because it was this repertoire was directly connected to Impressionism, symbolism, also the medievalism coming from Metterlink theories. So we can see that actually the first modernist theories were coming into the national musical theater through this kind of repertoire. And we can also point out that, these were pieces of theater that were based on mythological tales or mythological legends, and they have musical parts. So usually this repertoire has been studied from the theater studies, considered to be theater with music, and very little approach from musicology. But later on I will mention the musical relevance that I think that it has. But even if it's based on folk mythological content, also the religious groups were very interested and supported strongly this kind of repertoire, because symbolism kind of connected with the mysticism that the religious groups were looking for. So in the case of Catalonia, we have the genre of the musical visions that was hosted usually in moral and Catholic centers. These were the centers that provided a space for these amateur or these new companies to perform in. And here in Lithuania, we can see that, for example, the parallel would be the genre of the mysteries. And the massive performances that were taking place in the open air were supported and managed by the Catholic futurists. So we can see that religion is also focusing here on this repertoire. How does it look like? For example, in the Catalan musical visions, we can see the medieval content. We can see that a lot of medieval legends are used as the plots for these pieces. Also, with a very symbolic value, in the sense that you are stating that the nation existed already from medieval and ancient times. We can see very luxurious interiors of palaces, so they were also trying to construct very impressive stagings to attract the people. because they wanted to transmit these folkloral references to the people, so they will become familiar with the different myths and the different folklore. And the idea of modernizing the folklore was through staging. So if you present them very luxurious, very colorful, with electric light, different colors of lights that are mixing in these very new techniques in the theater, that was for them the way to modernize folklore and to make it attractive to people. So a lot of effort was put on the visual part. We can see also, for example, this piece, La Matinada, in the Principal Theatre in Barcelona, using electric light to perform. Basically, the event going on here is the rise of the sun in the morning, which is also a symbolic way of representing the rise of the nation, a new day, but also the people here dancing in the piece are workers that are dancing the national dance, celebrating that God gave them a new day to go to work. So a lot of ideas are being combined here, synthesizing the national awakening, also religious elements, and the nature is usually performed and represented because the nature has also a very symbolic value in contrast with the city. The city is perverse and the nature and the rural spaces are pure. So the national people that live in the towns, that the one that preserve the folklore are the pure ones, and the modern trends in the city are the perverse ones. So usually the nature is also used as a symbolic, with a symbolic value. And we can see here in these drawings also how the lights effects were being used. So, and they explained in text, and we don't have videos or color pictures to see that, but in these watercolors we can see that how mixing colors, light bulbs of different colors, we can, and turning on and grading them on a stage, they can represent the change of colors without having to change the actual background of the piece. So we can see that, for example, here they are using, on the same colors on the background, they are using yellow and white probably, and by introducing red, you are making it look purple. So a lot of changes are happening in space, and these were very attractive for people that had never seen electric light. So seeing the colors changing was very, very attractive to people. And for the Lithuanian case and for the Lithuanian mysteries, we can also see these same medieval elements happening here, the staging of Lithuanian mythology in episodes from the great Duchess of Lithuania and the Kings of Lithuania, also calling for this historical existence of the nation since ancient times. Also introducing a lot of spiritual elements and kind of combining the ancient spirituality with symbols of the new Christianity. So a lot of symbolic elements are here put together to be transmitted and create this idea of the nation. And we can see, for example, here some different programs. We see here Visijmones, a 3-act mystery with music, with songs, and with dance. The music is by Talat Kelpshas. And we see here how the staging was also, they also put a lot of emphasis on advertising the staging. We have here, for example, they are making emphasis that there are more than 20 different characters on a stage, including angels, demons, death, also that a god is going to be represented on a stage. And as I was mentioning here, we see in the drawing for the program how these, for example, the musical instrument coming from ancient times, this head with the spines that is calling for the image of Jesus. So a lot of different elements are being put together here to kind of create this new idea of the new nation. We have another program here, Amju Karzigis, a mystery with choirs and orchestral music composed and directed by Dambrauskas, also calling that the attention to the costumes, decorations, that there are more than 50 actors, 4 choirs singing on stage, where more than 300 people singing, also with ballet and dance. So they are very, very big performances. And another one that I want to mention, Likimokeliais, because its music was coming from folk songs adapted by Karnavicius. And we can see also here in the pictures, again, the representation of the nature and the sun with a very symbolic value of the purity of the people that lived in the rural spaces that preserved the culture, etc. So we can see that it's not only theater with music, but the music that it has is very relevant. There are also for the anniversary of Vytautas the Great in the 500th anniversary in 1930, also they were putting together big stagings in the open air with also hundreds of people singing there, with the soloists from the National Opera going to sing there, and with the technical stuff from the National Theatre to be staging these mysteries. So the musical relevance that it has is, I think it's also very notable, and it should be worth taking a look. And I wanted to put also these names on the screen because in the case of Talat, he was also one of the people involved in the creation of the National Opera. In the case of Dambrauskas, he also worked in the National Opera, and he's the one that reorchestrated Egle by Petrauskas to be staged on the National Opera. And Karnavicius himself was the composer for the first Lithuanian opera in independent Lithuania. So these are names, they are not amateur people that are writing some kind of numbers for the to go together with these pieces. We are speaking of very important names of composers that are also working in the opera institution, and very big orchestral masses and choir masses singing here. So I think that from a musical perspective, it also can be very interesting to be addressed. And I think that also, connecting to the last point, which is the National Opera, if we think of the titles of the Lithuanian operas being staged in Lithuania, for example, we would jump from Birute in 1906, and the next one staged here would be Gražina already in the 30s, the 33, if I'm correct. So if we only look at the opera, connecting to the first idea of the discourse of the National Opera, we would think that there's a gap here of more than 20 years with no Lithuanian musical theater. And actually, if we go and look to other repertoires, we see that not only operetta is being performed by the popular classes, but also this huge repertoire of mysteries with music is being staged. It has a connection with the opera because the same composers are working in both institutions. And we see that also if we think of Karnavicius and Gražina as an opera including these the folk songs references and using the medieval legends for the plot, we see that he had already been doing these kind of things and rehearsing in the Lithuanian mysteries, because he had been arranging folk songs and writing music for different mysteries before. So Gražina and the operas in the 30s that don't appear out of nowhere. There's a previous tradition of musical mysteries that is taking place, and the people have been already doing things here. So for example, the case of Gražina, I see kind of a connection of Karnavicius writing music for previous musical theater here, but also if we think of the case of the Tris Talismanae, which we'll see right now, I think it was the adaptation of a previous mystery. So we see that also the new titles of National Opera are being created coming from a previous tradition of musical mysteries. So I see a connection here that I think it's worth taking a look and connecting the opera, not only looking at the opera itself, but connecting it with other genres of musical theater. Coming to the last point, which is the national operas. We can find Liceu in Barcelona, that, as I mentioned, was not performing operas in Catalan. And we find here the Lithuanian National Opera. So they play an important role in terms of professionalizing the singers and the staff working in the theater, creating an international projection for the singers, and importing the international canonic repertoire of opera. So there's a cultural mission being performed here, but what they don't achieve is the creation of a new repertoire. They don't motivate, or they don't promote enough, or they don't start the engine of creating a new national repertoire of opera. And I go back to the idea that I was citing from Sofia Chiroloniene, that the institutions are not working here. In the case of Catalonia, we don't have national institutions, but here we see that in 1918 there's a national state, an independent state, that creates a national institution. But the problem is the same. These institutions, even though they are created, they don't start the engine of creating new titles of national opera. And we have to instead look at other genres of musical theater. And this is not only my perspective, but at the moment people were already saying that the national theater was not fulfilling this mission. Probably the most critical one that I saw was Mikas Petrauskas, saying that our Kaunas opera has nothing Lithuanian. Our artists do not try to promote their art at all, saying that our art does not exist. The society, having also received the mess of a foreign culture, got used to it because it is more solemn and, of course, cheaper, accessible without difficulty. So it was easier. He's criticizing that it was easier to take foreign pieces and translate them into Lithuanian than teaching new composers and promoting them to write a new repertoire, a new Lithuanian repertoire. But even if this is happening, let's take a look. We have some titles, as I mentioned, that are worth mentioning. So, for example, Grażyna, that, as I mentioned, is based on a medieval legend and includes citations of folk songs. We have Radvila Perkūnas, also by Karnavicius, portraying historical Vilnius. And we have Trys Talismanai by Antanas Račiūnas, as I was mentioning, also coming from a previous mystery. So a tradition of new titles is kind of starting in the 30s, but it is, I believe, important to see also what was happening before in other genres of the musical mysteries, because these trends come from previous essays of previous pieces. And the last element that I want to mention would be the religious element. As I've been mentioning throughout this hour, the religious component is kind of always there. Underlying, we can find it in operetta, we can find it in symbolistic theater, and we can find it in opera. The religious element is very present in both cases, because the Catholic religion was also a very important cultural element for both national movements and for the identity of both nationalities. So we see here, and for even not only for people that were activists or that felt themselves Catholic and that were participating of the Catholic political ideologies, but also we can see that composers and other people that were creating national repertoire, that were closer to the working classes and closer to ideologists on the left, were also including especially episodes from Christmas, because eventually the religion was very present in the national culture, so they end up making religious references in their pieces. We can see Sventoji Naktis by Petrauskas portraying the birth of Jesus, the Christmas. We can see also La Nit de Nadal being staged in the Principal Theatre in Barcelona, portraying the same episode of the birth of Jesus. And we can see also a medieval legend, El Miracle del Tallat, also in the Principal Theatre of Barcelona, about a Christian captivated by the Ottoman pirates in the Mediterranean Sea, that is miraculously rescued by an angel, and they end up performing a mass in the theatre to celebrate that he has been rescued. So the religious elements are put very forwardly in some cases to the public. We can also see the portrayal of Jesus himself in these two musical visions performed in the Principal Theatre in Sala Mercè about the resurrection of Yatzer and how Jesus that's this miracle of resurrecting him. And we can see also the image of Jesus in the Lithuanian repertoire. We can see here above drawings made by Liudas Truikis for the design of the Three Talismani opera, in which we can see clearly the image of Mother Mary with the dead body of Jesus on her arms, and the portrayal of Jesus with the crown of spines here. And on the bottom to the left, to the right, we can see the design for one of the characters of Egle by Petrauskas when it was staged in the National Opera. Also very clearly portraying the image of Jesus. And we do not only see the positive elements of Christianity, but also the evil or the bad ones. We can see also often demons and hell portraying what's going to happen if you don't behave well and even if you are not moral. So we can see here the demons that were dressed up for Belnias Isradeas by Petrauskas. And we can see here also the demons and witches that inhabit hell that were being portrayed in Las Calderas de Pere Botero in the Principal Theatre of Barcelona. So my conclusions would be to wrap up all of the ideas that I've been putting together here, that I hope that make sense all together. We could say that nationalist movements are ideologically plural, and therefore we have to take into consideration multiple discourses on how to create a national culture. There are more genres beyond the national opera, and each one will have a different social function. The citation of folk songs and myths is considered as the main element that make a piece national, but we also have to consider religious references and class issues when constructing the national history. And nationalist awakenings use the already existing genres and trends to create their own new national repertoires. As we could see when I was comparing the characteristics of both Catalan and Lithuanian cases, the national awakening and the process of creating a national culture is it's kind of similar. We can establish a common pattern, and also the different trends that they use and the different genres that they use to create this new national repertoire could be grouped in the same groups, and also are using kind of the same techniques of introducing folk songs, introducing myths. So we can see that contemporaneous nationalisms with similar characteristics will follow similar patterns when creating their national genres of musical theatre. And that's it. So thank you for the attention, and I hope there are questions, comments, disagreements that I can try to respond.